Hello and welcome to the final episode of Towards a Repair Society, a podcast series covering Dr. Peter Erde and Dr. Zsuzsa Sverdhelski's latest book, Repair. Today we'll talk about the concepts of the new normal, creative destruction, characteristics of a repair society, and pathways to a circular economy. In past episodes, we've acknowledged the problems of the world and how the state of the world may resist change. This time, the prevailing theme is one of shifting from phase to phase and where we would like society to be headed. Dr. Erde, would you like to start with the new normal concept, which gives us hope that things can be different?
Thank you, Jojo. Yes, I would like to start a discussion about the new normal with an example coming from physics. Water is generally considered normal when it is in a liquid state. Changing the environmental conditions and reducing the temperature below a threshold or increasing above to another threshold creates a new normal called solid ice or vapor. The fundamental states of matter are solid, liquid, and gas. And the process of phase transition takes a physical system from one phase to another. I cannot go into the details, but the concept of phase transition was generalized and adopted to understand sudden changes in many biological and social systems. Abrupt emergence of panic or social riots are well-treated examples. Another is the Nobel Prize winner Thomas Schelling's idea of micromotives in individual leading to collective social phenomena, which he called microbehavior.
Interesting. So these micromotives in people led to macro behavior in general. And we're talking about places where there is emergence of panic or social riots as being the new normal. But new normals can also be a good thing. They can also be shifts towards a more stable or fairer or better world. So when the world is changeable like this, I think shifting to a new normal, which is characterized by having its own feedback loops and mechanisms to keep itself stable and in place, that seems like an important way to make lasting change. I guess there might be examples where technology shifted society to a new normal, like the availability of birth control, helping to bring about a new age of equality.
That's right, Jojo. Inevitable, new states sweep away the old. Some people are not happy when it happens, but among crises, this is an opportunity, just like in economics. The famous Viennese economist Joseph Schumpeter came up with the concept of creative destruction. He suggested that capitalism, even after crisis, creates new products and markets and new organizational principles that can do away with the whole industries. For example, Henry Ford's assembly line is an historical example of creative destruction. It revolutionized the automobile manufacturing industry.
I see. So Netflix would be another example of creative destruction. It was a crisis of the video rental industry, but people get to watch TV more flexibly and probably more cheaply than ever before. So now that we've come up with a few examples of transitioning to a new normal, how do these concepts of phase shifts and creation following crisis relate to the cultural changes you promote in your book?
Well, a big goal with the book is to promote a transition from the throwaway society to the repair society. We think society needs transformational changes that alter the norms, values, and assumptions under which individuals and institutions function, similar to the paradigm change in science and technological innovation. And for a repair society, these would be social and cultural changes that minimize waste, are resilient to damage, and build towards positive transformation.
That sounds very good, but also slightly vague. So what are some characteristics of this repair society?
Yeah, repair society. many things come to my mind. In particular, it's cognizant of legacies or injustice and aims to control that harm and grant reparations. It also prioritizes a circular economy where what we now call waste is reduced and reused in the economy rather than discarded. It improves resource management strategies and prioritizes repair over abandonment. The concept of the repair society actually evolved from a concept of repair the world, coming from the early rabbinical literature, which was about the world being innately good, and its creator purposely left room for us to improve upon his work.
Thanks for that summary and background. I guess the roots of this concept of a repair society coming from Repair the World, which has been a little bit culturally popular in the past, at least for certain groups, means that maybe people today are more susceptible to taking it up, which sounds good to me. But let's go into the details. So what are you and Dr. Svitelski talking about with legacies of injustice?
This is a difficult question that I cannot totally answer, of course. We live in a world inherited from our ancestors. We don't want to state that the newer generations, so we, are innocent, but different versions of structural discrimination, such as racism and white supremacy, were initiated many centuries ago. We know how European colonialism led to the collapse and the loss of Aztec, Inca, and other cultures. It resulted in the loss of over 80% of indigenous populations. Systemic racism is persistent, and we can see from events like the killing of George Floyd that public awareness about it can change, hopefully leading to improvements. Post-colonialism is another big battlefield of social repair movements. It's hard to quantify the losses caused in the aftermath of Western colonialism, but the victims and their descendants suffered and continue to suffer a lot. A repair society cannot reverse history. We cannot do, but it can control the damage rippling from generation to generation. It aims to repair the harm to cultures and avoid repeating past injustices. Well, Jojo, you are from New Zealand, colonized by the British in the early 19th century. Can you share any perspective on social recovery from colonialism in New Zealand?
Well, I'm not very well versed on New Zealand history, so everything I'm saying has to go with a grain of salt. But like many indigenous groups facing colonialism, New Zealand's Maori tribes suffered terribly when Europeans settled, and Maori people continue to face systemic discrimination today, like you described. Back then, I think about 60% of the indigenous population was lost to disease, war, and starvation. A lot of land was taken and suppressed. It was a very bad time. But I also have the impression that Maori people possibly fared better under colonialism, as in they were able to resist better then and now than a lot of other indigenous groups facing colonization historically. I don't know how true that impression is or why it might be the case. Possibly the geographical remove of New Zealand from the rest of the world, particularly the Western world, might have meant that the resources that colonizers brought to bear to harm the local population were not as great. But yeah, I can't be entirely sure. So for an idea of the scale of all this, I think people of Maori ethnicity now make up about 15% of the New Zealand population today.
I think New Zealand might give us some hope that recovery from colonization may happen, right? I read that the New Zealand government recently proposed that school children should learn about the history of the Maori people and the British colonialism in a specific curriculum, consolidating the knowledge of colonialism and reflecting a renewed appreciation of Maori culture and history, which might be good.
I'm glad to hear it. I didn't know that was happening. Growing up in primary school, I learned a little bit about the history of New Zealand, the culture, and the conflicts and contracts between the Maori and British settlers. But it was limited to one or two land wars, a sprinkling of culture and language, and the Treaty of Waitangi that continues to play a major role in the treatment of Maori people today. But definitely not all schools prioritized that. So hearing that there's this new curriculum idea coming into place, it's quite exciting. But I do think that this would only be a part of the recovery from colonialism. I mean, at the moment, there is a lot of discrimination in the health system, a lot more incarceration of Maori people, a lot more domestic violence among Maori communities, and just generally quite a bit more unequal treatment, unfair treatment, whether intended or not, by the state and by actors that come from the state. So I think that all of those would have to be addressed, and it's not just a matter of education. But yeah, I'm sure that's fairly clear to many people who are familiar with colonialism and its discontents. But anyway, about this government proposition, did you read any critical responses to that proposition?
First of all, it was very interesting what you told. I didn't know about these details. And yes, some said that draft curriculum skews positive. For example, by emphasizing the country's short history of achieving one of the highest living standards in the world. But at the same time, I don't think it is easy to implement measures that adequately support improvements in living conditions without grappling with fundamental inequalities and colonial legacies.
That does sound about right. I think that this lot of inequality and fundamental mistreatment is definitely a serious, unfair, and unnecessary blow to nationwide living standards, and that the living standards are some of the highest in the world probably means that New Zealand has dealt better with the colonial history than some other countries might have. But of course, it's not just about living standards we're talking about when thinking about doing away with inequities. I think quantifying societal progress in terms of living standards might be a bit of a Western concept. And when it comes to healing from colonial history, I think it's important to take into account Indigenous voices and priorities. So, for example, I think Māori values generally prioritize taonga, roughly translated as treasure of a culture, like the environment and languages. So if a lot of the ways of directing social progress in New Zealand are relying heavily on Western metrics like living standards and GDP, these ideas of taonga and other things that the Indigenous people prioritize might not be given appropriate weight. So does the concept of the repair society engage with these ideas?
First of all, I would like to emphasize that the repair society is not only about living standards and material things. We also argue about the importance of belonging. Particularly, we agree with Zsuzsa very much that we people should belong to several different communities. Some people say 3-4 communities. While I'm totally ignorant, I can imagine that a Maori belongs to a social group dealing with the preservation of traditional culture, and at the same time has a job, say, well, I'm don't know, a financial advisor.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So we might even think that the repair society would want to strengthen that belonging to a community and a culture in a way that our current paradigms for how society should be don't focus so much on that. But let's move on out of interest of time. I want to talk more about the circular economy idea. I've seen it touted as a solution to a lot of problems like waste and pollution. So what would a transition to a sustainable economy that reuses everything require?
First of all, The circular economy is not a silver bullet for all social problems, but I believe it can make progress on the issues you mentioned. As for what a circular economy would require, we need new technologies, circular technologies and good morals. So once again, technological development and good morals. Circular technologies are in opposition to linear technologies, which convert crude materials to products and waste substances. In an ideal circular world, technologies would convert waste to crude materials to be reused once again. Of course, the laws of physics are irreversible, so we cannot do with 100% efficiency.
That makes sense. But I imagine it would take a lot of social support for a circular economy to get the government to promote developments of such technologies. What I mean is that for the government to promote enough technology that the circular economy would be possible, everyday people would have to care about it. And maybe organizations who have an interest in opposing that development because they benefit more from a linear economy might make this transition a bit more difficult. So until then, what else can be done? You write about this concept of a sharing economy.
Yes, I believe that is a very interesting new cultural phenomenon and also a new business model. The sharing economy is related to the circular economy in that both models seek to reduce societal waste. The sharing economy is a means to improve our morals and forces us to accept that we should not necessarily own things privately, but actually circulate things to places where they are needed at the times they are needed. So for example, your power drill in your garage doesn't sit there doing nothing for most of the year, but it's passed around through society and sees a lot more use. We see now that sharing economy business models are rapidly spreading across the world, and we could consider them as seeds for a cultural change.
Right. So the sharing economy would help promote a circular economy because of the overlapping cultural norms, and also would fit into the circular economy because of fewer products and less waste. Nice. It seems to be about making private goods into public goods, but actually a lot of scholars talk about issues managing public goods. They often get taken advantage of, depleted, not recovered. Would the repair ethos address this?
A repair society would hope too. You are right that circular and sharing economies would need better resource management strategies that we have now. A lot of public goods issues have been modeled in economics, famously the tragedy of commons. And in response, people like Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, have designed cooperative solutions to get around resource management issues. Ostrom studied community strategies for managing exhaustible resources and found that it's possible to make decisions that ensure the long-term protection of resources without government interventions. Once again, without government intervention. She abstracted a number of rules, occasionally called design principles, which should and could provide for the healthy functioning of a community. Her solutions go beyond usual top-down regulatory approaches and advocates for community and individual participation. Sometimes really large-scale or global problems can have local solutions.
I think that's quite empowering. I'd be a lot more optimistic about the feasibility of circular and sharing economies if these cooperative solutions can be successfully implemented. For everyday people, sometimes we look at these global problems and feel like we can't possibly make a dent. We might be more likely to try and make positive changes in the world if we know that addressing problems immediately around us can actually make a difference more globally. Now, we're coming upon all the time we have left, so I want to ask you to close with some discussion about kintsugi, the centuries-old Japanese method of repair mentioned in your book. I thought it was a pretty metaphor.
Thank you. Yes, kintsugi might be called the golden repair of failures. It's a way of fixing objects, mending things like teacups and bowls with gold filing. Rather than denying breakages, it emphasizes the beauty of recovering from them and of acknowledging history. When you see the gold rivulets, you might think of imperfection, but Kintsugi interprets it as a cultural gain. Still, I believe this is fantastic.
Yes, thanks for leaving us with that lovely image. To recap, today we talked about new normals, which can be thought of as stepping stones in positive cultural change, as well as destinations. We talked about the Repair Society, its economic and cultural elements, and its acknowledgement and intention to build better from the past. This was our last episode. Thanks very much for joining these conversations with myself and Dr. Eri. Have a great one.
Jojo, many thanks. Thank you for the wonderful conversation with you. I enjoyed very much. Thank you.
Yes, it has been lovely.